The following is a presentation of Apologetics Press.
In this session, we're going to continue our discussion about true science being the enemy of the evolutionist. Now, in the previous session, we talked a lot about life spontaneously arising from non-life. And we talked about how when Charles Darwin first started to repopularize the theory of evolution, again, the theory of evolution was really first proposed over 25 centuries ago. But when Charles Darwin first started to repopularize it, there was this tremendous effort by evolutionists and atheists to try to find some way that life could spontaneously arise, to find some simple life form, some imperfect life form. We talked a lot about Ernst Haeckel and how he claimed to have found simple, imperfect life that he called Monera, and how he'd even studied them and knew their behavior. But again, of course, we also found that once the scientific methods had improved, once the capability of science had improved at that time, that they discovered that Monera actually didn't exist. They were just, again, just simple compounds precipitated, inorganic compounds precipitated out of seawater. And so, again, we see this general theme that as science progresses, as science advances, if we move from primitive instruments, primitive techniques to more sophisticated techniques, we see time and time again that true science is the enemy of the evolutionists. And I believe at the last session we concluded by pointing out that even the evolutionists themselves now realize this problem. They've calculated, say, the odds of simple proteins forming and come up with odds of, say, 1 and 1 followed by 135 zeros. Just impossible odds, even for a simple protein. Talked about Fred Hoyle's calculation of the proteins in an amoeba being able to randomly form. Again, showing that those odds are really insurmountable. I believe he calculated 1 and 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. And again, far worse odds for just the chemicals needed to form a simple organism. And so, again, the theme, true science is the enemy of the evolutionists. What we're going to continue with today is talking about if we were to have, say, simple life somehow in existence, is there any credible mechanism for that simple life to turn into more and more complicated life? And again, want to stress simple life, vastly more complicated than anything humans have ever been able to create. So there really is no such thing as simple life. But for the sake of using common terminology, if we were to take what evolutionists would call simple life, is there any credible mechanism whatsoever for turning that simple life into more and more complicated organisms? Now, a mechanism that's often proposed by evolutionists is natural selection. And so I want to read a quote from a biology textbook about natural selection. And I should point out right up front that both evolutionists and creationists agree that natural selection works. And so there's no debate here. And so this is another point. It's interesting that a lot of times in the discussion between evolution and creation, a lot of times a straw man is set up against a creationist, the idea being to set up a straw man and then show how easy it is to knock down. And a straw man set up claiming that somehow creationists don't believe in natural selection. And again, as we talked about in the first session, creationists believe strongly in natural selection. They realize that since death entered the world, natural selection has been in action. But let's go ahead and read a description of natural selection, again taken from a standard biology textbook. It says, variation is the raw material for natural selection. Living things face a constant struggle for existence. Only some individuals survive and reproduce. Natural selection results in genetic change. Species adapt to their environment. And examples that are typically given are peppered moth, sickle cell anemia, blind cavefish, and bacterial resistance to antibiotics. And so again, with this particular definition of natural selection, there's really nothing in that definition that creationists would disagree with. Now, where the disagreement starts to creep in is oftentimes textbooks, instead of calling natural selection, they'll start to refer to natural selection as microevolution. And the idea is, they say that natural selection, since it can result in small changes in organisms, that these small changes, they call them microevolution, and somehow the inference is that if you have lots and lots of microevolution, that eventually that would lead to macroevolution. And what we'll see is that microevolution is actually meaningless in terms of the overall viability of the theory of evolution, or it actually shows the opposite. In other words, what people will call microevolution actually shows the opposite of macroevolution. The reason for that is microevolution, natural selection in action, the genetic information that's being selected from already exists, and quite often when natural selection occurs, genetic information is actually lost. So in other words, when natural selection is acting on pre-existing genetic information, that action can result in part of that pre-existing genetic information being lost. When that occurs, that is actually the opposite of evolution. And so lots of microevolution, rather than leading to macroevolution, actually would lead to the opposite of macroevolution. And so that's a point, and we'll make that point on several slides. But again, that's a very important difference. The creationists and evolutionists agree on natural selection, but it's borderline deceptive to call natural selection microevolution. The reason that's borderline deceptive is, again, by trying to have the student or the reader infer that obviously lots of micro leads to macro, where in the cases, all observed cases of microevolution, it's either neutral, not applicable to macroevolution, or it's actually demonstrating the opposite of macroevolution. Start out with some typical examples given in textbooks. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the textbook version of these examples. I'm going to start out with the peppered moths. The reason I say the textbook version, there's actually been a lot of talk in the past few years that this whole peppered moth story may have been fabricated, that it might not have actually occurred at all the way it was presented in textbook, literally for decades. And so, but I'll go ahead and give the textbook example of the peppered moths. And the idea, again, as presented in biology textbooks, was that there's two types of peppered moths. You have the typica form, which you see on the left side of the screen, that is typically it's has a light and dark modeling on it, and that's called the typical form. And then you also have the carbonaria form, which is a very dark form of the moth. And so as you can see, you have a type of moth that's kind of lighter with a little bit of dark spots on it, and then a very dark colored moth. And the idea was that before the 1850s, or the way the story goes, most of the peppered moths that people would find were the lighter colored moths, the moths that were fairly light, but they had some dark speckles on them. And very few of the pure dark, very few of the carbonaria form were found. And the reason is that the moths would sit on birch bark, and the typica form would blend in much better with the birch bark and be much harder for predators to find. And so, in other words, if these moths were sitting on birch bark and a bird was flying around, the bird would not be able to see the typica form, but would be able to see the carbonaria form. The carbonaria forms would tend to get eaten, and that resulted in perhaps 98% of the moths being the typica form and only 2% being the carbonaria form. But then the story goes that during the Industrial Revolution, had a lot of soot released into the atmosphere. And so we have soot being released into the air. That soot deposits on birch bark, and now the carbonaria form blends in better. In other words, since the birch bark has been darkened, it's soot colored, the carbonaria form blends in better with the bark. The birds flying along cannot see the carbonaria form, but now all of a sudden the typica form does stand out because of the light coloration on that form, and the birds tend to be able to eat the typica form. And so now in a situation where most of the typica form get eaten, the carbonaria form survive, and the population reverses. Again, some textbooks say that it was as high as 98% of the moths were now the carbonaria form, and only 2% were the typica form. Then we get to the 1950s, and nations began to put very strict anti-pollution laws in place. In other words, they required scrubbers on smokestacks, really tried to get the air pollution problem under control, and the birch bark became lighter, and then the population reversed back again. So in other words, now most of the moths were the typica form because they blended in best with the birch bark, and the other 2% or few percent were still the carbonaria form. And so that's the peppered moth story as given in textbooks. Now, the evolutionist view of that is that these peppered moths, what happened with the peppered moths in the population, that showed natural selection in action. But they go further than that by saying that not only did it show natural selection in action, that this was microevolution in action, and that, again, given time, microevolution would lead to macroevolution. So in other words, this just showed that the moths, the population distribution of the moths could change, and these changes, if given enough of time, this type of change could eventually have the moths not just stay peppered moths, but actually turn into whole new species. Now, a creationist will agree with the first statement, that it did show natural selection in action. As selection pressure changed, as more of a certain type of moth was eaten, less of another type of moth was eaten, then the population distribution would respond accordingly. But the key difference is that example has nothing to do with macroevolution. And again, the reason is that the genetic information needed to make the typica form, the genetic information needed to make the carbonaria form, existed at all times. In other words, there's no new genetic information that was created. The genetic information was always there. And so even though we see these changes in the population density, it has nothing to do with evolution. There's no new genetic information generated. And that's really the key for macroevolution, is somehow have to find a way to generate just a tremendous amount of new genetic information. The analogy we used in the first session, again, talking about trying to write an entire encyclopedia just given a sentence about butterflies. Well, that's very appropriate here in that you're not able to, there's just no new generation, no new generation generated by the fact that these moths are changing populations. Another example that's often heard, I think many of us have heard about how bacteria are evolving resistance to antibiotics. And so again, it is very true and certainly a concern that bacteria are developing resistance to antibiotics. And that's again something that creationists and evolutionists would agree on, that bacteria are developing resistance to antibiotics. But the question is it really evolving resistance, or are they just developing resistance? 60 years ago, antibiotics were first starting to come into play, and people were first starting to notice that some antibiotics or some bacteria would become resistant to, say, penicillin. There really wasn't a lot of understanding in the field. In other words, there really wasn't understanding how that occurred. And of course, with evolution being the popular theory, it was postulated that maybe these bacteria were indeed evolving resistance to the antibiotics. But again, true science, the enemy of the evolutionist. As true science advances, we now know the methods that bacteria become resistant to antibiotics. And there's really three methods that can occur. First method is that the information to resist the antibiotic is already in the bacterial population. So in other words, in this particular case, with the information already in the bacterial population, say there were out of a million bacteria, maybe 10 of those bacteria were just naturally resistant to an antibiotic. And so when that bacteria first infected a person and they were given an antibiotic, 999,990 of those bacteria would be killed by the antibiotic. But 10 of those bacteria would still survive. Now, if the person's immune system was able to kill the other 10 bacteria, then that's it. That whole infection is gone, the bacteria are wiped out. But suppose those 10 bacteria survive and then they begin to multiply and they form a colony of a million bacteria. Well, now all of the bacteria, or at least all million of those bacteria, would now be resistant to that antibiotic. And so now there is a antibiotic resistant strain of the bacteria. And so that's one way that bacteria or populations of bacteria can develop resistance to antibiotics. But again, has absolutely nothing to do with evolution, because the information to resist that particular antibiotic was already in the genome. It was already in the DNA of the bacteria. Now, a second method that bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics is known as plasmid transfer. And in plasmid transfer, basically one germ inserts a tiny tube into another, and a small loop of DNA called a plasmid transfers from one to another. And so in other words, in this particular case, when the loop of DNA that is transferred, well, that can, say, be transferred from a bacteria that may be a harmless bacteria, but happens to have an ability to resist a certain antibiotic. If that plasmid is transferred into a harmful bacteria, now, again, there is a harmful strain of bacteria that is resistant to a particular antibiotic. But again, in this case, it has nothing to do with evolution, because the information to resist that antibiotic is already present in the genome. In other words, the DNA, the coded sequence needed to cause a bacteria to be resistant to a certain antibiotic was already present in the genome, and it was just transferred from one bacteria to another. So again, in that second case, we see no evidence or no support for the theory of evolution. You're just seeing natural selection or information that's already in the genome being used or causing bacteria to develop resistance to the antibiotics. Now, a third way that bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics actually shows the opposite of evolution. In other words, in this case, information is actually lost. For example, in some instances, a bacteria can become resistant to an antibiotic by losing a control gene. For example, if a bacteria were to have a control gene where a certain amount of a certain enzyme is produced, with that enzyme making the bacteria resistant to an antibiotic. Well, if it loses that control gene, it'd be like pulling the thermostat out of an air conditioning or a heating unit. So you pull the thermostat out, heat's either on full blast all the time or the air conditioning's on full blast all the time. It's a less sophisticated system, but in some situations you could at least view that as maybe not being harmful. But in the case of a bacteria, again, you pull this control gene out, now a tremendous amount of a certain enzyme is going to be being produced. And typically, if that bacteria is just out in a normal environment, that's bad for the bacteria. In other words, it's wasting all of this energy producing an enzyme that it really doesn't need that much of. But if that enzyme happens to make it resistant to a certain antibiotic, now if bacteria have infected a person again, that person takes an antibiotic, well, all the bacteria that have not had this information losing mutation, if they all get wiped out by that antibiotic, but then this one bacteria that has had that mutation will actually be more likely to survive and multiply and become a resistant strain of bacteria. And so the point being is that is another way that bacteria can develop resistance to antibiotics, but it's a way that involves actually a loss of information. And again, we're talking about trying to turn a relatively simple organism into a very complex organism, which requires a tremendous amount of new information to be generated. And so even in the case of bacteria, even though we will often hear bacteria evolving resistance to antibiotics, we again see that that has nothing to do with evolution. It's actually showing the opposite. I heard a great analogy once, microevolution. Again, either information is conserved or information is lost. And so the question is, given lots and lots of microevolution, could that lead to macroevolution? And the analogy was, is say someone decided to go into business. And so they formed up a business, and every time they made a sale, they either broke even or they lost money. Then the question was, of course, well, can they make that up in volume? In other words, if you either make zero money or lose money, what's going to happen the more you sell? Well, obviously, eventually, especially if you're losing money on some sales, eventually you're actually going to go bankrupt. You're not going to have a successful business. And so the same analogy again applies when we look at what evolutionists will call microevolution. We either see information staying the same or information decreasing, actually losing information. Again, the opposite of macroevolution. Now, what's interesting in this case, and you see it across the board, is a lot of times the evolutionists, they'll act like, well, if they can just find one case where new information is created, then that'll somehow prove their cause. And despite the thousands of cases that we can observe that we've measured showing that information is typically lost or at best conserved, evolutionists, they'll almost pretend that if we can just find one case where new information is generated, then somehow everybody should believe evolution. Well, again, that's it's faulty logic at best. It'd be like, again, we go back to the life from non-life. And suppose, and I personally don't think it will ever happen, but suppose after hundreds of billions of dollars of effort or trillions of dollars of effort, thousands of people working on it, best labs in the world, suppose someone was able to create something that was kind of similar to life. Well, would that prove evolution? No, it would just prove that given, again, hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars of effort, smartest people in the world, best laboratories, that maybe they could eke something out that, what at least they might claim would be something related to life. The point being is, we know we can build space shuttles. And so the question is, because we can build space shuttles, does that prove they can randomly form? And of course it doesn't. It just proves that it takes a tremendous amount of effort to build space shuttles, and in no way would indicate that space shuttles could form. But again, evolutionists, and if you read articles on the web or wherever, about every 6 months there'll be someone claiming that he's got something that he's going to say is kind of like life and claim that somehow that this is a huge breakthrough for evolution. The same thing is you see in this area where they claim that if we can just find one mutation, just one, that somehow added information, that somehow that should make everybody believe in evolution. Well, the case in this area is already closed. We know that mutations are harmful. They are at best neutral or result in a loss of information. And so the case is really closed. But again, this is an area that you will see discussed if you get into the literature, if you really start pursuing this matter further. Other examples that are sometimes given as evidence for evolution, when we see natural selection. And here, a lot of times, I believe in a lot of natural history museums, they will talk about how the changes we see in life are evidence for evolution. And so they'll talk about changes. They'll talk about either natural selection, which is really what we've been talking about to some extent, but even going further, saying natural selection of say wild animals or things that are possibly more visible, more noticeable to people, claiming that natural selection, these changes we see in the population, changes we see in life, is somehow has to do with evolution. Again, it does not. It's simply selection pressures acting on the original created kinds, acting on the genetic information that is in the original created kinds. And then they'll also talk about even selective breeding. And so occasionally you'll see a reference to the fact that we see new breeds, new breeds of dogs, new breeds of cats, new breeds kind of being developed or bred, that somehow that's evidence for evolution. We see just the changes or the new, really just even you could call them new breeds of cats and dogs that are available. Somehow that's evidence for evolution. But again, in those cases, it is really showing the opposite of evolution. To give an example, if you take two, say, wild dogs that you might find just living on a street, somewhere, and you breed those dogs, if they have a lot of genetic diversity, in other words, if they're truly mutts, if they truly are just wild mutt dogs, you can typically breed either very small dogs from those wild dogs or very large dogs from those wild dogs. In other words, that those wild dogs in their genome, they have the information needed to make very small dogs or to make very large dogs. And so that would be selective breeding. But the problem is once you've bred those very small dogs or bred those very large dogs, you've lost genetic information. In other words, I can take two wild dogs, I can either breed small dogs from them or large dogs from them, but once I have a population, say, of small dogs, I can no longer breed large dogs from those small ones because I've lost the genetic information to create the larger dogs. And so what we see in a lot of purebred pets, a lot of purebred dogs, even purebred cats, is you have, because so much genetic information has been selected out, a lot of times they will have specific characteristics that are actually harmful. There'll be types of dogs that are, say, notorious for having hip problems or sinus problems or other problems, and this is a result of the highly selective breeding to breed certain traits, but also getting rid of genetic information that is very useful. So again, when we see changes in life around us, those changes are the result of natural selection and mutations acting on information, genetic information that was present in the original created kinds. Again, in no case do we see new genetic information being created. And that's consistent with information theory. But again, the point being is probably every month or two, someone will come out and say, hey, I think we might have created some new information. Every time that has been shown incorrect. But the point being is even if that somehow did occur, the case is already closed. We already see that the general trend is downward. It's either a loss of information or at best a conservation of information. I heard another good analogy, and I think this is appropriate, is random mutation is truly random, and we know that mutations are bad. If we want to, say we're developing a new nuclear reactor, and we wanted to perform some tests on it, well, one might think, well, you could just set that reactor out in the middle of a field somewhere and turn it on and get all the people away, get all the people down in a bunker, shielded from that reactor, and turn it on, see what happened, and then turn it off and go see what happened. Well, turns out we're not allowed to do that from a regulatory standpoint, and that's good. And the reason we're not allowed to do that from a regulatory standpoint is what they call genetic burden. In other words, even though that reactor is out in the middle of a field and running, we realize that it's going to be causing mutations to the grass, or there might be small animals in the area. And the radiation from that reactor, if it's completely unshielded, could be causing mutations in those animals. And so we know that as genetic burden, and we know it's harmful. And so mutations are universally recognized to all but the evolutionists as being harmful. And that would be what would be expected because, again, as we talked about in the last session, DNA is incredibly sophisticated. Just the information that's coded in our DNA, the coding, again, for just the physical structures of life is incredibly sophisticated. And what a mutation does is just randomly change that. Maybe one way of looking at it is if, say we were to type up a term paper and we typed up a 50-page term paper and we got it just exactly the way we wanted it. We'd poured over it for months and months and months, had it exactly the way we wanted to, had just the information that we wanted in that term paper, but then we decided we wanted to just really put the final touches on it, really make it just perfect. And so what we did was we positioned the cursor just kind of randomly in the paper and closed our eyes and slammed our hands down on the keyboard. Now the question is that really going to make the term paper better? Well, of course it's not. What we're going to do is damage the information content of the term paper. Depending on exactly what we did, we would likely potentially lose information. We might certainly lower our grade a letter or two. But the point is, we wouldn't expect random mutations to be beneficial when they're starting out mutating something that was created in such a perfect form. And so consistent with common sense, what we know about mutations and the harmful effects of mutation, given genetic burden, given studies of people that have suffered mutations, or great exposure to mutagens, and then also given what we observe about the types of changes we see, what we see occurring in natural selection or selective breeding, all of those tell us that mutations do not create new genetic information, and they are not a viable mechanism for somehow turning a bacteria into a human being. And so, again, a very important point. It's, again, relatively new. Our knowledge of DNA, our knowledge of how mutations act, and our knowledge of how physical characteristics are expressed is still developing, and it's just developed tremendously over the past few decades. But given that knowledge, we again now know, as science has advanced, true science is the enemy of the evolutionists, and we now know again that you do not generate new genetic information via random mutations. Another area where the advances in true science have shown that evolution is, at least some of the premises of evolution are false, is an area called vestigial organs. And this is kind of interesting. In the late 1800s, again, when people were looking for ways to support Darwin, or at least evolutionists were looking for ways to support Darwin, looking for ways to try to claim that evolution was true, there was this argument put forward, and it's called vestigial structures. And the idea was that these vestigial structures were organs or structures in our body that were just evolutionary leftovers. They really served no purpose. They were just there because they were there before we became human, when we were some pre-human life form. Read a couple of quotes. This is a quote from a popular biology textbook. It says, "Vestigial structure that is a remnant of an organism's evolutionary past and has no function, from the Latin vestigium, meaning footprint." And so that's the atheistic evolutionist definition of a vestigial organ. Now, from a biblical creationist standpoint, we realize, again, it's been 6,000 years since Adam sinned. You would expect some degradation in the functions of certain organs given that amount of time. But vestigial organs, at least as defined by the evolutionists, do not exist. In other words, there is no such thing as evolutionary leftovers. People didn't used to be apes or some other lower life form and somehow are carrying forward these vestigial forms. And again, so the biblical explanation is also that vestigial structures, again, that were highly popularized in the late 1800s, really was just evidence for scientific ignorance. It had nothing to do with evolution. Go on a little bit about what's also taught. Again, these are some quotes. It says, "Vestigial structure is a body part that no longer has a function. How is a vestigial body part evidence of evolution?" What I like about this quote is when it says, "How is a vestigial body part evidence of evolution?" You see, this is also a very popular theme in a lot of biology textbooks. Rather than teaching the students to think objectively, to really be objective about the evidence, they try to view everything in terms of how is this evidence for evolution? Anything you see, how can that be construed to be evidence for evolution? Again, in the first session, we talked about that as being really a characteristic of false religions, trying to construe them so that no matter what the evidence, no matter what happened, it was somehow evidence for that particular false religion. We see that in this case, and we'll have a few more examples, but again, just where many of the biology textbooks will even go as far as any observation that's made, try to somehow construe that as evidence for evolution. Another quote, and this was available at the time of the Scopes trial, says, "There are, according to Wiedersheim, no less than 180 vestigial structures in the human body, sufficient to make of a man a veritable walking museum of antiquities. Among these is the vermiform appendix. These and numerous other structures of the same sort can be reasonably interpreted as evidence that man has descended from ancestors in which these organs were functional. Man has never completely lost these characters. He continues to inherit them, though he no longer has any use for them." And again, we won't have time during this seminar to talk about the Scopes trial, but it's really a fascinating study. But this was some of the pro-evolution evidence that was available during that particular trial. Now, We move on to what's not taught. Basically, to sum it up, is that functions have been found for all structures and organs that were once thought to be vestigial. So again, functions have been found for every one of those 180 organs and structures. And so really even the evolutionists have stopped using this argument. Now it still makes the popular press. I believe one of the a popular magazine had an article on vestigial structures in about 2004. And so again, it still occasionally makes the popular press. But this particular argument now has even been typically thrown out by the evolutionists, although again still appears in many biology textbooks, natural history museums, and certain so-called science type magazines that are geared towards the public. The other points related to this type of argument is a few years ago when we were first studying DNA, or first really starting to understand DNA, if some of you might remember, for a few years there was talk about junk DNA, and this kind of flared up that there was this junk DNA. Maybe that junk DNA was somehow left over from our evolutionary past. But again, we now know that all DNA has function, or the more we study DNA, the more we define functions for DNA that was previously thought to be junk. So again, this is another evidence of not for evolution, but just of scientific ignorance. In other words, science not progressing to the point where we understand a function and then having evolutionists try to claim that that's support for their theory. And again, there's nothing wrong with scientific ignorance. That's what makes science fun. But we, again, have to realize that that's what it is. We have more to learn, and not that it's somehow support for a false religion. Few quotes on, again, what's not taught relative to vestigial structures. I want to read a quote on the appendix. The appendix was probably the last holdout. In other words, that was one of the last organs or structures that occasionally an evolutionist would still say had no function or was somehow evidence for their belief. It says, although it used to be believed that the appendix had no function and was an evolutionary relic, this is no longer thought to be true. Its greatest importance is the immunological function it provides in the developing embryo, but it continues to function even in the adult. The function of the appendix appears to be to expose circulating immune cells to antigens from the bacteria and other organisms living in your gut. That helps your immune system to tell friend from foe and stops it from launching damaging attacks on bacteria that happily coexist with you. By the time you're an adult, it seems your immune system has already learned to cope with the foreign substances in the gastrointestinal tract, so your appendix is no longer important. But defects in the appendix and other immune sampling areas may be involved in autoimmune diseases and intestine inflammation. So from that particular quote, we see again numerous functions of the appendix have been identified. Let's read another quote relative to the appendix. It says, in humans, the appendix was thought to have no physiological function. However, it is now known to play a role in fetal immunity and in young adults. During the early years of development, the appendix functions as a lymphoid organ, assisting with the maturation of B lymphocytes, it's a type of white blood cell, and the production of immunoglobulin A antibodies, both of which help fight invading germs. In addition, at around the 11th week of fetal development, endocrine or hormone-producing cells appear in the appendix. These cells produce peptide hormones that control various biological mechanisms. And so again, the more we learn about the appendix, we learn that it has certain functions, or functions that are very important, useful to humans. Other vestigial structures, just quickly, some used to be talk about the initiating membrane. That's it's kind of a pink lump it's kind of on the nose side of your eye, basically. I used to be thought that it had no function, but now we know that it secretes important chemicals that are contained in tears. It also enables us to have a wider field of view without actually having to move our head. Human hair was once considered vestigial. Fairly quickly, it was known to have certain functions. What's great about the design of human hair, it can both keep us cool in the summer, meaning if we're sweating, it keeps the sweat from just running off our bodies. Holds the sweat up against our skin so it can evaporate and actually provide a cooling function. But in the winter, the human hair can also keep us warm. If, say we get cold, we get goosebumps, the hair can actually stand up, reduce the airflow over the skin, and actually help keep us warm in the winter. So again, very sophisticated design in that area, and some pretty obvious functions for human hair. Tonsils and adenoids, again, once considered vestigial. In the 1930s, it was almost, if a person could afford to have their children's tonsils taken out, they would have their children's tonsils taken out. Started to notice that had some potentially damaging effects, and so the fraction of children having their tonsils out. It went from roughly 50% in the 1930s down to about 1.5% in the 1970s. And that was, again, because if a person's tonsils are healthy, we realize that they serve important functions. And so again, in all cases, organs and structures that were previously thought to be vestigial, important functions have been identified for those organs and structures. Another area where true science is the enemy of the evolutionist, in the area of what's called transitional forms or missing links. And the reason this is the enemy of the evolutionist is the idea is in the process of, say, a bacteria turning into a human, there should be lots of transitional forms or lots of intermediate steps. In other words, some of the steps that have been proposed, they propose that perhaps land mammals somehow turned into whales, or they'll propose that maybe dinosaurs turned into birds. And we'll talk about that a lot more in future sessions, but just want to give a couple of introductory slides as we wrap up today. And I'll start out just talking about some of the missing links, at least associated with human development. In other words, the idea that looking for missing links that somehow would give some indication that maybe apes turned into humans. And I'm going to use two famous examples, and the reason for these two famous examples is this was evidence that was actually available at the Scopes trial. Again, the Scopes trial being a separate subject, but it was really a trial to determine if professors or atheists should be allowed to teach that humans evolved from apes, that somehow apes had developed into humans. And both of these cases were presented or available as evidence that somehow apes could turn into humans. And so the first example is called Nebraska Man. And as you can see from the slide here, Nebraska Man was based on a tooth found in February of 1922 in western Nebraska. And that tooth was declared human by Dr. Henry F. Osborne of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. It was announced to the world in April, and the Illustrated London News of June 24, 1922, published articles, illustrations, and a pedigree of the human family drawn up by experts. And again, this was cited as proof of evolution during the Scopes trial of 1925. And that probably seemed like a pretty convincing case, especially, again, now we're used to seeing artists' illustrations, we're used to seeing very fancy computer graphics, but really to see a drawing made back in the 1920s that showed that much detail about how our prehistoric ancestors somehow looked, it had to be pretty impressive, had to probably convince a lot of people. Well, the problem, again, true science being the enemy of the evolutionist, was in 1927 an additional tooth was found, but this time there were other bones associated with the tooth. And rather than being some type of a pre-human or a human evolutionary ancestor, it was determined that Nebraska Man was actually just an extinct wild pig. And so again, true science is the enemy of the evolutionists. Another famous example was Piltdown Man. Now, Piltdown Man was viewed as a potential missing link really from about 1912 to 1953. And it turned out it was actually a very elaborate hoax. Some bones were basically planted near Piltdown, England. They took the skull of a human, a 500-year-old human skull, and they tried to match that up with the jawbone of an orangutan. But the jawbone of the orangutan had been altered. It actually had the teeth filed down to appear a little more human, so it wasn't quite as obvious that it was just the jawbone of an orangutan. And then those bones were allowed to be found. And again, this, as with Nebraska Man, this particular skull or this combination, it was declared to be human, and it was, again, viewed as some kind of a missing link or some kind of evidence of apes turning into humans. Now, an important question that we need to ask here is, the way this hoax was discovered was basically just by looking at the evidence. And the file marks on the teeth, the file marks on the orangutan jaw that was used to make this hoax or to construct this hoax, they were actually visible. And so the point is how could a fraud that was that obvious have gone on for about over 40 years? And then one possible answer to that would be because it gave the answer that evolutionists were desperately seeking. Again, if we assume that evolution has really become more or less an official state religion or a false religion that has at least been embraced in this country, then there'd be very little opposition, very little incentive, very few people brave enough to speak up and say, hey, what about those file marks? And doesn't it seem kind of suspicious that the pulp chamber has been exposed on these teeth? Just basic questions. But apparently they weren't asked in this case because, again, it was giving the desired answer, given the answer that people were desperately seeking. Again, for anyone really looking at it objectively, looking at scientifically, it was a very obvious fraud. And this really comes back to a main point about fossils, which again we'll cover a lot more in the next session, is that fossils can really be interpreted very subject to interpretation based on the desired outcome or the desired significance of the fossil. And so a wide range of interpretations, same fossil, and oftentimes how a fossil is interpreted is really just based on what a particular theory or what the current in vogue theories are related to that particular species or that particular fossil would be subject to, and can often have very little to do with any actual fossil evidence. Again, we'll continue on true science being the enemy of the evolutionist in the next session.
This has been a presentation of Apologetics Press, an organization dedicated to the defense of New Testament Christianity. Visit us on the web at apologeticspress.org or call 800-234-8558.